Hello everyone, today we talk about the Khitan, Liao Empire's warfare, the first episode of the new series about ancient and medieval Chinese warfare, China and her enemies fundamentally. And so we take a look a bit differently from the other ones we made on, let's say, Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East so far that are somewhat more detailed. Um, in a more condensed sense, meaning, normally, as you know, I split videos on the base of certain polities, peoples, and we make one video for each thing, like organization, tactics, single battles, and so on. Here we have slightly less information, not even that few telling the truth. So we will likely condensate more in this regard, so much that today we talk about, in fact, the Kitan, Liao's empire. So we are from essentially from the beginning of the 10th to the beginning of the 12th century in northeastern China, fundamentally, with borders with Mongolia and Manchuria. Actually, that's the location, even partly with North Korea, because they infiltrated those direction, and even launching raids in China towards the south. But we'll see it better now, and talking essentially about the whole package, about the whole military as such. And the Liao Dynasty came to power was essentially essentially a pre-Mongol empire, so like was a steppe culture occupying much of northern China, established by the Khitan people, right? The Liao is the dynasty fundament, and they swarmed out of what would now be southeastern Mongolia and smashed the Fohai kingdom of the Liao-Tung Peninsula. So it's essentially close to Korea, just in the west of it, the Yellow Sea. And they established an important Sinicized empire at this point, so controlling even certain parts of China proper, and therefore creating also a kind of a hybrid between a steppe culture and a more sedentary one. It has some important features. Naturally, the information that we have here is somewhat scannier, but also we have to be careful, naturally, at contextualizing everything in its cultural reality. But there are very interesting things about this people that was essentially the warlike one of the steppe that was coming to perturbate, let's say, the Chinese affairs that were actually quite critical at that point, with lots of powers containing control of the enormous region, multiple regions we could say about China, and that suffered this nomadic infiltration that, however, was coming part, essentially, being of Chinese culture itself. So during the early 10th century, the Tang dynasty had already been disintegrating, which is what, broadly speaking, from a political point of view, had brought the Kitan to move south, right? And to this expansion, there was not much opposition, in fact, as any resistance was somewhat feeble and or collapsed in the process. And this is what rendered it possible in the first place, if you want. In 946 AD, the Khitan sacked the capital of the five dynasties kingdom of the later Qin, right? And this brought the Khitan to in direct contact with the Sung dynasty. For in the 11th century, the Sung were even forced to pay ignominious tribute to these Khitan for an unsteady peace, right? So they were naturally blackmailing the cow to milk it, and they were asserting, in that sense, their domination on the northern areas and profiting from it. So, as we were saying before, the Khitan Empire, the Liao Empire, as it comes to be formed, occupied most of Mongolia, actually central China at some point too, in addition to the northern one, and is a remarkable power in the times and places. So as a nomadic culture, the Khitan based their military on cavalry, almost exclusively, right? These were areas where, as we've seen, at the frontier between the nomadic and the sedentarized areas, and in this sense, it's a bit of a dichotomy, as we've seen in Europe many times, probably between the area where there is just nomadism and those where there is a urbanized dimension with therefore important agricultural output, crop rate, and so on. So there is a hybrid between these cultures on a scale that is really impressive, as we will see in the military organization of the Liao army. So the basic term that we encounter so much and that we have adopted even in our Western language is the ordo as the basic unit of the Liao army organization, right? The Chinese for ordo was voluto, right? And the Hannic one auto, right? That meant king, fundamentally. And the Kitan word ordo, right, is essentially the one we have in Europe. In fact, in every language, horde, horde, basically in all our languages. And this is how impacting these military cultures were transcontinentally, right, for us to even have adopted properly, it through the various ways of, especially the Mongol invasion and the states that remain relatively close, if not properly in Europe, in the far east of it. Now, typical ordo under the Emperor Tai-Tsu, as is documented during the 10th century, was constituted by the following element: that is, bodyguards and retainers. So these were probably the royal forces, the imperial forces. Then, essentially, Pohai prisoners of war. Then, essentially, resettled Chinese and Khitan armored cavalry shock troops. This practice of kind of colonizing the areas with settling properly some parts of the clans or other forces. And then naturally there were also some local levies from the occupied territories as well that served as just militias to make mass, but not being quite consistent. Also because that's the point, right? That if you occupy a territory, it's because you have taken out the elite, and then the rest of the people are under your control, your command. And we know only some paper strength ordo organic, right? Because we don't know essentially how many from documentation existed on campaign, right? Because first of all, there were multiple ones. This is a problem we have also with later Mongols at some level, at least, that you may never know in medieval armies who was who within the broader number, but in part it's not even so important. Also because it varied naturally in strength, and essentially the Khitans relied mostly on shock troops that were essentially the only reliable troops within the order, right? The prisoners, as we've seen, the senior retainers, were not meant to fight most of the time, right? That were essentially support troops. That tells how important cavalry warfare was altogether, and properly shock troops. Not only, right, these were essentially the thing, shock plus horse archery, and the rest of the troops naturally supported in other ways we'll see now, but also for not just in combat, but in case of necessity, of emergency, but properly also in logistics and so on. We have some numbers of the ordos properly. 951 one consisted of 2,000 armored cavalry. 983 of 3,000, and in 1031 5,000, and in 1125 6,000. So it seems, of course, there is an increase in the dimension, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean that there was a maintenance of the quality. On the contrary, it seems that this had collapsed in terms properly of moral political cohesion and moral resistance. And the increase of such numbers may evidence that this is to say, given that these were, paper strength forces, that it's speaking of a broader sedentarization over of this people, and the capacity of drawing. Of course, the power grew over time, also extensionally so, but it was a way to coerce more of the subjects, even just so. This speaks of some of the dilution of the Khitan power altogether. In fact, the largest force is at the very end of their empire. Naturally, there were lots of other peoples fighting for the Khitan, right? These had become the strongest power, right, in the region. So lots of other surrounding populations were fundamentally brought under their sphere of influence, if anything. So there were allies, mostly tribal auxiliaries, practically, and also because it was easier to make such raiders coming from the steppe, right, to join their forces. We know in 986, the Jurchen, that is essentially these people that would come eventually, that was first crushed by the Khitan and then eventually came to crush them in turn and bring an end to the Liao Empire, had joined the same Kitan after suffering defeat at their hands, right? And so much it's speculated that thus they learned under them the art of war, right? At least the Liao art of war that was quite advanced at the time, and therefore, rising through the ranks is this force that, albeit crushed, had been, had survived, and therefore had probably nurtured this resentment and hostility towards their masters. They had given them an opportunity, but also had somewhat reinforced them within themselves to the point of becoming those who would put them down in turn. And such tribal allies were altogether organized like the Khitan, right? But it seems that the best fighters were sometimes grouped in an elite unit. I think that this might have been true for the same Khitan, right? Traditionally, right? The idea that there is to be properly a spearhead that is also connected to politically to the children of the elite, or this tributary ally, because the hierarchy follows this kind of gradual submission of the various clans to others, the most powerful ones, and so this vertical relations bring, of course, the elite to kind of stick to reinforce itself also within that, over the mass of the population over it. And there was also, as we've seen, a militia that constituted perhaps the least important element in the Liao army, and they were from a political and social point of view. Militarily speaking, we see Chinese and Kitan infantry fundamentally, including, so we're talking about pikemen, as we will see, but also crossbowmen and artillerists, right, artillerymen, that were used in the important dirty work of siege warfare that, the south, the further south they went, they would have encountered. So the objective of these steppes peoples was naturally, as we've seen, kind of civilizing at the end of the day, enjoying the benefits of that. And infantry is necessary for siege warfare in a way or not. In open field, these forces were of secondary relevance. They could be used as a kind of throwaway forces to contain and to preserve cavalry, so essentially being sacrificed sometimes also on their way. But we don't have to underestimate that the combined arms dimensioning here that we can observe from there doesn't seem to have been much moral consistency in these forces, so they wouldn't actually make a big deal of difference. But still, they were not just primitive forces, right? It's important to stress how such equestrian nomadic element was combined with some infantry, right? That in the steppe had always existed. Actually, it's never just purely cavalry, but of course, especially in such cultures, it's not a big deal. But when you have, again, to venture into more civilized dimensions, you really need to integrate these elements. And the extent to which the Liao Empire managed to do it tells us that, you know, the deep Sinicization, most of the artillerists, for example, were Chinese, right? Just by extraction, they had also probably also higher status of the rest of the militia in a way or another. I mean, there were less. The artillerists doesn't make mass, right? Mostly the engineers and the thinking brains that are costly at that point. But still, all this know-how, technological capacity, etc., for siege warfare is really important. The basic unit of the order was this regiment/battalion of around 600 men, between 500, 700, divided in turn in companies of 100, right, according to a decimal order. And the regiments, in fact, 10 regiments also have here in the organic, constituted an ordo, or column, right? In 10 columns, orders would create an army or side, let's say. And the vanguard also was important in these armies, mostly, you know, lighter cavalry, at least, as you know, for screening, exploring capacity. In the largest forces was, you know, an army with 3,000 up to 3,000 even. This is documented. And albeit we're not satisfactorily documented on the internal segmentation of the forces from a tactical point of view, it's safe to assume that, in spite of the emphasis that is placed by the sources on the fact that these were mostly heavy cavalry, right? So armored horses, some kind, were various degrees, right? And that an order in itself was naturally composed of different types of troops, and probably not just by cavalry, but by a certain standard. It depends. The field aids, of course, were there, but also these other forces were aggregated constantly. So it's a bit like saying, I don't know, the Roman legions plus the auxiliaries, or, you know, the medieval knights plus the peasantry. Right? It was always there, right, in order to, as a tactical complement with which you couldn't really do much. So the hint could be, of course, was especially a cavalry segmentation. As we've seen, cavalry was the main arm. There's no doubt about this, but they might have been of different degree of armoredness, and especially also having at the elite properly cataphracts, right? Properly all covered, all armored cavalrymen and horses, right? Or partially armored horses, at least, because, you know, that would have been exceedingly costly, and also, you know, would have forced this more kind of agile nomadic steppe tradition to rely on something much more, you know, structural in nature. It's more like a sedentary thing, right? But still, right, they had by tradition also this partially at least armored horses. Surely there was some complete armored horse. It depends on, you know, on the numbers, on the quantity, what that makes on the field. And I think that any kind of saying idea proportion is kind of speculative among this cavalry typology, right? But it's possible that I presume that the various regiments could be of, you know, different degree of armoredness, or however, that if there was an numerical equivalence among them, etc., they might have been homogeneous, with properly all of them having the various typical segmentation of, you know, in fact, of the degree of armoredness. We have an interesting document which is a list of 12 orders of the Emperor Tai-Tsu, right? And so what I'm going to read now is the commander's name of the order, or whom the order is fundamentally delegated to protect. Right here, for example, there is an empress as well, so she wasn't factually commanding, but ideally So and also there is the name of the order with the translation of the term, which is, as you understand, is very religiously meaningful most of the times, and then the amount of cavalry in the order. Always remember that these guys are steppes people, so they are obsessed about cavalry because that's the only thing they see as a, even properly from a military cultural point of view. Who fights on foot is just less, right, of a thing. So there are 12, as you've seen. So Tai-Tsu, the order's, so this commander's name, the order's name is Swan, which means the emperor's own 6,000. Then the empress Ying Tian Pu Suvan for the development 5,000. Tai-Tsung Guo Lian to rule the country 5,000 cavalry. Shi Tsung Yeluvan prosperity 8,000. Mutsung Toli Pen to pacify 2,000 cavalry. Ching Tsung Chen Mu to transmit 10,000 cavalry. Empress Dowager Chen Tian Kuven Jade 10,000 cavalry. Sheng Tsung Nuku Gold 5,000 cavalry. Xing Tsung Votuvan propagation 10,000 cavalry. Tao Tsung Asu extensive 15,000 cavalry. Tiansu Aluvan to assist 10,000 cavalry. Xiao Wen Qi Xin Pen filial piety 5,000 cavalry. Right, so as you understand here, you could maybe guess what are, you have the emperor's own, right? Then you have the emperors proposed to development, right? Others to rule the country. There's not even so many. Others for prosperity, others for pacify, and for transmitting. The largest forces are for the transmission, the propagation, and the golden jade, right? So one is filial piety, properly. You understand the religious connection to of these. They would have made their esprit de corps, but also properly displaying some functions, some religious, some rituals, and so on. And it is fascinating, and the numbers are impressive, and this, if you've considered on paper, it's also an enormous force, right? But on paper, as a matter of fact. Speaking of training, right, the steppes peoples had maintained this kind of monad-like unit base that was logistically self-sufficient. They produced their own weaponry on themselves, they supplied them themselves, they were a clan that was internally cohesive, organized, and this was like the Mongols later on, right? They were properly responsible of their own their own members, the individual members' behavior, right, in combat, etc., in the face of the higher authority. So much that if somebody from that clan had misbehaved in battle, the clan would have been punished entirely for that. So this was a way that naturally in the methods of still is typical of the steppe was used to essentially create a discipline where there is no higher, there is no structure state capable of enforcing it. So this kind of disciplinary measures were strong as long as, of course, these people was kind of hungry and cohesive in combat. They knew what they wanted, right? And so it's always this thing, these various waves of people that eventually kind of soften up and crumble, and then the more warlike, the more pressured one comes again, and so and again and again. In fact, if this was the kind of disciplinary standard, if you look how the Jurchen actually conquered them, which was very easy, or at least very, very quick. It makes you understand that at that point the Khitan political cohesion had somewhat collapsed, and together with it, their military quality. They presumably, yes, it was a kind of a collective training of sort coming from these familiar structures, but also the more the empire expanded naturally in a more direct, more engineered way from the top. Especially logistics was a big deal for peoples that in the steppe do not have to fight against walls, and and now that they are into something more advanced. So there had to be properly a strategic coordination and a supply system capable of supporting this camp, this operation. And the standard training of these peoples mostly revolve around the typically step maneuver, that is to say, to always alternate the troops in the front line. That is to say, the weary, the tired ones, exhausted ones have to fall back, and the others fresh ones, fresh reserves have to replace. Right, and the objective, as we've seen, their tactics were, after all, quite simple as far as we can see. We have documented among also other steppes peoples from the western side. Right, were normally deployed like in a single line. Right, that poured the majority of these horsemen, the lighter ones, were all horse archers. Right, were at least equipped also with various weapons, as we will see. So they were to fight in different ways according to the role, but in practice they were mostly horse archers, right, with an elite of heavily armored cavalry for shock, right? And the deployment was on a single line, right? Everything was relatively unsophisticated, and even though their military culture actually was, but tactically wise, this was the idea, right? A simple line. So essentially the orders in one next to the other with intervals or spaces that could serve also to make some other forces pour in, intervene occasionally. Auxiliary cavalry was mostly stationed on the flanks, right? So the place of honor was in the center, and in the order of battle, the unarmored cavalry was in to form the vanguard, right? So those were the archers skirmishing against each other, probably not even coming to hand to grip. Well, okay, it might have been very common actually, but still the objective was essentially to outshoot the enemy, right? So this thing of substituting the horses, the horsemen all the time, was to maintain the fire constant on the enemy. To at the end of the day, the more who was more worn out at parity, let's say ideally, of shooting capacity would have succumbed, right, and the other would have won the battle. And behind the horse archer line was a seemingly something like 100 meters of distance, the armored cavalry, and then in the followed at other 100 meters distance from with ever heavier cavalry, right? So probably some degree of armoredness that changed from the first to the third line, right? It was still a single line though, because if you, I'm not entirely sure of whether these distances are correct or whatever, but you see, normally, yes, I mean 100 meters is okay because it kind of ideally, or it's a short enough distance to support each other, but to still consider yourself part of a single line in a way. Normally, battle lines, when you see in other contexts in military histories, they were more distance, right? Sometimes even half a kilometer, to avoid that in case of disruption, this thing can fall against the other, so during the retreat, causing a dreadful domino effect. Here you have a more, a closer mutual support between these tactical specialties. They're ideally part of the same section, right? Even so with a single line, not really three, as they would appear to be in a sense. It was a relatively, safe and logical way of fighting after all. And the infantry would be stationed apparently properly in the bottom of the formation. So we're talking about the Chinese engineers, the artillerists, and the militia, right? And their objective seemingly was to march up through the intervals if necessary, which is interesting because if we're talking about a significant presence of heavy cavalry, which is something that, as we've seen in other steppes context so far, we have never met, but here we're seeing an army that is kind of more structured and heavier, and so it's not just a purely equestrian system, a pure step-like fact. That there is an integration of infantry in a way, and the fact that at that point archery was widespread, as you understand it here, but still there was a heavy element. So a cavalry was meant to properly charge and come to grips with the enemy and to be armored for properly being heavy, having this shock capacity on such a, we don't know the proportions as we were saying before, but it means that at a certain point of the battle, right, these heavier elements have to clash, right, which the horse archers preferably will not do. So at that point, the infantry could support cavalry, and especially on the flanks, as you understand. If this was the deal with the corridors that were created between the orders, the orders, it was about essentially falling on the enemy's flanks while engaged. Right? Of course, the enemy would have their own infantry, mostly, at least, not entirely. As we've seen, the Liao Empire was this hybrid between a more nomadic and sedentary thing. So, in spite of a prevalence of cavalry, apparently in general, we don't know just how much. But so the idea is that infantry has to be skilled enough to also counter each other. Right? Crossbows, for example, are an anti-cavalry weapon, meaningfully enough. Pikes, as you will see, at least lances, 2 meters 70, something like that in length, right, will do something, right? These militias do not seem to have been particularly armored or anything, but that's not important because, if you're fighting against an infantry that is equally equipped, but the effect kind of neutralizes itself in part, and just they were not rich enough to equip themselves in other ways. But having, some important stopping and also missile capacity, this infantry was not completely irrelevant. So the idea is that if you knock out the enemy infantry that you find in the front, and you can then fall on the enemy cavalry flank as a consequence, and so take it out. So that would make quite sense as a tactic, and I think that would have properly been done. There was some sophisticated organization in terms of deployment, maneuvering. There were prearranged code names shouted to bring units into their proper place in battle line. That is not so complex, but still, it requires a specific order. As for typical of so many steppes cultures, there was this great drum signaling the advance, right? And properly, the drum is this thing, from this tonic, terrible thing that echoes within your chest and brings you like in a trance, like in an hallucination, in a hypnosis towards death, right? With all your, without, right? That was, in fact, especially for the infantry, right? Or for the broader formation in that sense, to advance, right? Well, a blast of trumpets indicated a halt, while a clash of gongs or conch shells that hits more the tympanum was for the charge, which is instead a much more celestial cavalry thing, in that, for the immediate, tells you about the immediacy of the attack, of the suddenity of the attack, and therefore something you have to do also with a certain specific timing. So, in all this, as you understand, there is a very fascinating hybrid that in the West I've personally never seen so combined. It is essentially what could be a Scythian tactic, literally of firing volley upon volley of arrows, then eventually followed by, however, close support of an important amount and exploitation by an important amount of armored cavalry. Some say, it was mostly about horse archers in this. That will think, well, I don't think so, because horse, like missile powers, never stop at anybody. Right? If you don't have a stopping force, a heavy something like either cavalry or infantry, you don't stop anybody. Right? There's never been a missile army that stopped heavy, in fact, something that they can't stand the ground against, and that's prerogative of horse archery. So actually, I think that at least, well, of course, the Liao Empire changed in ways that I frankly don't even know, and I don't think we know even at this point, that would bring towards, as we've seen, that process of civilization, sedentarization. So my idea is that this heavy cavalry existed as much as also some kind of infantry support could operate, and that the horse archers in this regard were not necessarily maybe the single most important thing in the tactical balance. So much again that crossbows also in the West are developed by cultures who are in constant contact with the steppe, and also developing that stopping capacity against question all mounted tactics were were successful, right? And so I think that here in China, in the frontier, as it was, but still, nevertheless, in presence of this more sedentary elements with an important, military capacity, aside from the collapse of the moral force of the political cohesion, right? China was undergoing definitely not a very easy time, but they were probably capable still as a tactical formula, especially when integrated as infantry or specialists within such important cavalry power. It's remarkable. So also the same weight of the Liao cavalry here is the Khitan cavalry is remarkable in the sense that for a steppe culture you don't really have so many numbers that emphasize such heavy armor, and as we will see, also equipment, right? So it's really an advanced military culture, and it would be also interesting to retrace properly the political and social dynamics for which this thing collapsed at the end of the day. And still, however, we rely mostly on something theoretical, either dispositive sources, as we'll see, that is equipment issued, and or this paper strength of the orders and so on. So the idea was exhausting the enemies with arrows in a sense, but then to bring in the heavy cavalry, because there is no other way. And again, I don't think that heavy cavalry would have been knocked out before time, before engagement, just by missile. Also because these things tended to eliminate each other mostly at that point. And in fact, there is an aspect of properly the Liao army in the empire's success in the first place through its military, that the surrounding peoples, this kind of barbarian steppe-like tribes, were fielding mostly light cavalry archers, right? Even the Chinese kingdoms themselves, telling the truth, didn't have a great stopping power to oppose, to counter this guy. And the happening of the Khitan cavalry seems to derive from this great political success. It was not normal for a people at that time to be that heavy, especially in cavalry, right? In let's say there was heavy cavalry, but the Equestrian culture were mostly, as we've seen, overwhelming most about lighter troops. Instead, you get this astonishing account of, as we will read now properly, of the equipment, of the arms they had to bear. It was something incredible, and literally incredible and implausible at the same time, because it would have been just too heavy at that point for a cavalryman to bring all those weapons with them. Also, we have to think that in these 200 years, tactics may have varied importantly. That military the army organization in the first place, it might have been much more contingential, let's say, strategies than we think, right? So also putting the army together in this broader, there was some kind of broader direction, control, etc. But how organic, how continuous this military system was, we don't understand clearly. So we are seeing of a people that enrich itself at the point of providing such important material wealth for a consistent part of its army, while Chinese armies in the meanwhile had degenerated, as it happened periodically in Chinese history, into mobs of infantry and rabble, so with poor motivation and poor training. That, in this sense, also explains Liao's superiority at that point in history, right? So I would say any speculation about the numbers, the consistency is very, I don't know how necessary it is. Probably all these various troops that we've seen were heavenly balanced in a sense. It wasn't a dramatic prevalence of any of these, right? It seems just that, at least for some evidence, that armored cavalry was particularly consistent, even up to probably not surpassing the half, not even reaching it, of the effective, but something like, 40%, which is a lot, really a lot, and it doesn't fully convince me either, right? But it's possible if we consider particular imbalances, like were happening in such great systems like the Chinese one at the time. And the equipment is crucial, right? And probably this also fluctuated over time, but we have some interesting evidence from this. There have been studies now. I don't know how much they have progressed over time. I'm not an expert in Chinese history nor in Chinese military specifically, but speaking of this famed Khitan Liao armored cavalrymen, well, we would see equipped with really a very heavy panoply. So first of all, it would dispose of multiple horses, like 3, right? That's what they were required by the empire. 9 pieces of armor, saddle, cloth, and bridle, leather or iron frontal horse armor. So it's basically a chanfron and frontal, right, which makes sense in general. That's the first kind of part, together with the pectoral of how you want to protect a horse normally, and that is also meaningful because it shows that, of course, there was a frontality, like there was properly an axis. It's not just the wild chaos of the steppe where at least the elite has to be preferably all kind of armored in a way, but there was also part of that because arrows were all around. They were naturally, as we were saying before, they are quite effective anti-horse, an armored horse, let's say, weapon. 2 composite and 2 self bows, which suggests also diversified employment of such horse archery. 400 arrows in 4 quivers, right? So if we count, in fact, as we were saying before, an order of 6,000 of these horsemen, but it was probably there were less. But we're talking about ideally it's something, but the others would have had arrows as well. 2,400,000 arrows. Right now, bringing 400 arrows, it's just like it's extremely heavy, right? You have, 100 just arrows per quiver. You can imagine just volumetrically what this means. Then imagine also the weight. Then 1 long spear and 1 short spear, 1 club, 1 axe, and 1 bannered halberd, the sin, right? It was famous in China, was used also by charioteers. In fact, also cavalry properly took, or just being and by infantry, which is fascinating because it's just this kind of fishing, like using it on horseback. You can. A spear is a lance is better, right? But this thing allows you to kind of hook the enemy as well, which is like imagining this heavily armored guy in the midst of the mass of the cavalry trying to literally fish for enemy limbs at that point. But again, if you look at this list, right, you realize that this is unrealistic, right? Who could bring all that kind of equipment, right? We don't have to underestimate the level of de facto professionalism that such armored cavalry could have in the heyday of the Liao Empire, given this predatory, militaristic capacities and warlike culture and so on. But this is just ultra heavy at the point of also relative employment at some point, employability, let's say, in the field. A more standard cavalryman, like maybe the final rank type, could have been equipped with essentially lacquered leather band armor, things like that, operating mostly as a skirmisher, but not only. So being equipped with bows, javelins, and swords. Remember the club and the axe for the heavier guys that have, in theory, 9 pieces of armor, so that also have to smash through enemy armor, right? So these guys, javelins are also usually effectively anti-armor, but a close distance, in fact. Even if they mostly have to make this hail of arrows, a shower of arrows over the enemy, still they have some kind of offensive capacity. They lacked horse armor, perhaps, generally, and most of the personal armor, and also the halberd of their heavier counterparts, but they could be equally dangerous in terms with a lance, because they had it, and so they could have some minimal, impact even against heavier cavalry in certain situations. I don't know, following them on them from the flanks or things like that. There was among these cavalrymen always kind of ranking based on the type of dress they could wear, right? For example, only the high nobility, the highest nobility, wore sable, right, with a purplish black sheen being preferred over a plain black one. Then, in order, followed airmen, ship, mole fours used by the lower classes. As far as we understand, the Liao officials wore a tunic known as kalat of dark green, fastened by buttons to their left. And that's maybe both, because iconographic evidence is, yes, it's present, but it's not complete in a systematic sense, right? For the infantry, that, as we've seen, were mostly conscripts and not really much to be relied on, but still, they were called, the contempt towards them was such that they were called pohai by the Kitan. So essentially identified with the people, the more century people they had subjugated in Manchuria. And so saying, what are those guys? But they are, the pohai, right? Even if they had maybe nothing ethnically to do with them, maybe they were saying Kitans, but they were considered so inferior that they were the defeated par excellence, right? And in fact, they were composed not just of Khitan and subject tribal levies as well, but also by Chinese forces, and among which, especially the artillerists, as we've seen, were quite prized. And as far as we understand, spears were, as I was saying before, 270 centimeters long, roughly. Shields were small, which suggests that probably the stopping power of this infantry wasn't that great, but that they may have helped still, as we were saying before, falling on the enemy flank when this was required, or operating against other infantry for that matter. That is a good indicator that fits with the idea of just cavalry being stationed all in the front ranks, and then these guys being just used as reserves, because otherwise they would have developed maybe something greater, like in terms of shields, of something that could parry, that was properly on the fore, right, to resist. They could be used like that as well, but just their resistance would have evaporated quite soon, especially with that low degree of protection. This militias could be equipped with crossbows, as we've seen as well, and swords. So again, this makes us suggest they could be kind of light assault troops in kind of desperate situations, and or in sieges and things like these. But even there, probably I don't know about this, but I think it's quite likely heavy cavalry would have dismounted to storm fortifications and things like that. But so this infantry is interesting in any case, even though it was kind of light and not particularly reliable. There was no uniformity, as far as we understand. I mean, there were some clanic maybe affiliation with some symbols and things like that, where maybe some, as we've seen, distinctive force, mostly from the steppe economy, but also some from the sedentary areas, from Chinese fashion, all these things, some kind of clothing that was maybe some units worn in a way or another. So drab colors would have been the norm, and perhaps just the Chinese artillerists, especially the most prized ones that made the money for selling their service to these peoples, were more kind of flamboyant in appearance, to ostentate luxury and so on. But all right, so there are a couple of battles where we don't really understand much of what happened. One is the Battle of the Shao River, fought in 986, right, when the Khitans crushed the northern Song. And simply the Song general Cao Pin and Pan Mei had been informed that the garrisons of Liao-Tung and Peking were under siege, so they marched to relieve them. And the Khitan general Liao-Tung defeated the Song armies before Peking. And the Song army was routed completely, and while attempting to escape by crossing the Shao River, was essentially intercepted by the Khitans, who were there in large numbers, and they were virtually eliminated quite concretely. Then there is also the conclusive battle of the Khitan parabola, let's say, that was one of the Yangtze River in 1125, when the Yurkans defeated the essentially the Liao army and bringing to the collapse of the empire. So, in the ensuing route, the Khitans tried essentially to escape south into South China, probably because this was inundated with the rice paddies, and they hoped that thus their escape could have been more secure, so that the Yurkans would have not following them. Instead, they were kept being pursued, and they tried to cross the Yangtze River. But the Southern Song, that remembered, what the Khitans had done to them, and were not their friends, blocked the crossing sides. So what actually is that only the Khitan general Wu Chu managed to escape, while his army was annihilated as well. So, this was the first, as I was saying at the very beginning, the very first Chinese military history video I make. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.